Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Every time there's a climate conference or meeting, we're told we must do this or that in order to meet our Paris Agreement targets. But how many people actually know what the Paris Agreement is all about? Robert Lyman, Ottawa energy policy consultant, contributed a blog post to us called Just the Facts, and he should know about these international agreements. After all, he worked in government as a public servant for 27 years, and he was a diplomat for 10 years before that. So here's a concise version of Just the Facts on Paris. 1. What exactly did COP21 commit countries to do? Well, COP21 contains no commitments for the parties to the agreement to meet any emissions reduction target, either globally or individually. It contains very few binding legal requirements. There's no formula for determining what each country's obligations are, and there are no legal penalties for non-compliance. What did previous agreements commit countries to do, and how did that work out? Well, in 1997, about 150 countries committed under the Kyoto Protocol to reduce GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, by an average of 5% below the 1990 levels by the 2008 to 2012 period. China and India never signed the treaty, while the United States signed but did not ratify it. So 3 of the largest emitters in the world stayed out. In 2011, Canada, Japan, and Russia announced that they would not take on further Kyoto targets. Canada withdrew from the Kyoto Treaty in December 2011, citing its objection to being required to pay up to $14 billion in penalties when no other country was being so penalized. Now, what has happened to global emissions since countries started adopting emissions reduction targets? In spite of governments' repeated agreements to reduce emissions, from 1990 to 2014, global emissions grew by 62%. And what did the COP21 parties commit to do in their first submissions of individual nationally determined contributions, or INDCs? Well, even optimistically assuming that promised emission cuts are maintained throughout the century, the impacts of actions to be taken pursuant to COP21 are generally small. All climate policies by the US, China, the EU, and the rest of the world implemented from the early 2000s to 2030 and sustained through the century will likely reduce global temperature rise about 0.17 degrees Celsius in 2100. That's 17/100ths of a degree. Is it true that China's INDC shows it to be the world leader in addressing global warming? We hear that a lot. Well, no. The Chinese INDC projects that this will be accomplished by making the economy less emissions intensive. Even if these goals were attained, however, Chinese emissions by 2030 would be 2 to 2.5 times as high as those of the next largest emitter, the United States. And what are the current sources of energy consumption in the world? Well, according to the International Energy Agency in 2012, roughly speaking, there were liquid fuels at 33%, coal 28%, natural gas 23%, nuclear 5%, and renewables 12%. But that includes everything like burning wood and dung and hydro. Wind and solar energy actually combined account for less than 2%. And how are greenhouse gas emissions projected to grow in future according to the most expert sources? Global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions will grow from 32.3 gigatons in 2012 to 43.2 gigatons in 2040, and that's a 34% increase. 91% of the emissions growth will take place outside of the OECD, mostly in China, India, and Southeast Asia. So there you have it. Seems meeting the Paris Agreement is really a big puff of smoke and mirrors. No wonder the art of the deal man, President Trump, pulled out of Paris. We incorporated this information into a new report for banks, pension fund trustees, and insurance companies called Unfriend ENGOs, Befriend Facts. because these environmental non-governmental organizations are making catastrophic claims about climate change and the Paris Agreement, and none of these are supported by the evidence. Often, NGOs pull stunts or make crazy statements that no regulated industry could ever make, like this press release by Greenpeace that mistakenly went out with "insert Armageddonist factoid here." These NGOs are naming and shaming large institutional investors, banks, and insurance companies with hyped-up scorecards based on the Paris Agreement, based on that nonsense. They're calling for insurance companies to pull insurance and investment from essential energy firms. And why? So that some vulture investor can snap up those valuable shares for less? These NGOs and a charity called the CDP Worldwide have damaged the reputation and share value of Canadian oil sands, resource and forestry companies to the point that investors, insurers, and banks backed off, and hundreds of thousands of Canadians, especially Albertans, are now jobless. Pipelines are blocked, and all in the name of the Paris Agreement that might reduce warming by 0.17 degrees Celsius if every country met their targets. That's just not going to happen. In short, divestment is an eco-shakedown measure designed to demarket valuable energy shares that continue to be in demand worldwide. And they're using NGOs that engage in public shaming, intimidation, and hyped-up fears of imminent climate catastrophe. This method is especially successful on UNPRI signatories and CDP Worldwide compliant corporations. But private funds are not required to comply. The Paris Agreement and climate catastrophe hype is the platform for all of this activity. Who will reap the benefits of valuable, divested, uninsured resources? So have a look at our new report, Unfriend ENGOs, Befriend Facts, and share just the facts on Paris Agreement. CO2 is not a control knob on climate variability. The sun drives climate change, directly and indirectly, in conjunction with the ocean. The Paris Agreement won't stop either of those. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.